How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yomi Chullin, Daf 113 of Masechta Chulin. Friends, Daf 113, we talk about salting meat to remove the blood and some other related oozings. Then we get to a tiny little Mishnah followed by a less tiny Mishnah. In the less tiny Mishnah, we discuss which meats and which milks are chayav for basar bechalav. What about cooking bird meat? What about cooking non-kosher meat? What about non-kosher milk, etc.? So that is going to be the second part of today's daf. So friends, come join me. Let's have a great time studying Daf Kuf Yud Gimel, Daf 113 of Masechta Chulin. Friends, we begin Daf Kuf Yud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Rav Mari Bar Rochel. Who's Rav Mari Bar Rochel? I believe he's the grandson, the neched, the einikel of Shmuel. Rav Mari Bar Rochel, imlach lebasar shchuta bade basar treifa. Rav Mari Bar Rochel, he slaughtered meat, kosher meat, together with treif meat. Kosher meat together with treif meat. Also, the comment of Ravid. So he came before Ravid to figure out if this is a problem or not. What would be the argument to say it's not a problem? The argument to say it's not a problem is based on this sort of concept that has been coming up the past few days that, well, while meat is busy expelling its blood, it is not absorbing anything else. And therefore, since the kosher meat is busy expelling, it's not going to be absorbing anything from the treif meat. However, Omar Le Ravid advised Rami Bar Rochel that hatmeim, the extra hay by sheritzes, it says by sheritzes elu hatmeim lochem b'chol hasheritz, etc. So from the extra hay by sheritzes, in which we're applying to treifa as well, it says lesor tziron v'rotvan v'kipo shaloin, that included in the prohibition of sheritzes, and we're saying treifas as well, is tziron, which is any liquids that ooze from them, that are released from them as they're being salted. So in addition to blood, this also includes any liquids that emerge from them. Virotvan, any liquids that emerge during cooking. Vikipa shalan, and any residues of their meats and spices and things like that. So we see that these tziron, these liquids that separate from sheritzes and also from treifas are a problem. Okay, now this kosher meat we're saying is busy expelling, so it's not absorbing, right? Well, it won't be absorbing blood, but it says Rashi, right? Where it's tzira treifa shu noach libola min adam, that this brine that's released from the meat as it's salting, not the blood, but this liquid, this brine is more absorbable, and it's more easily absorbable, and therefore there is an issue over here. That if you salt the kosher meat together with the treif meat, the brine, the tzir that is going to be released by the treif meat actually will be absorbed by the kosher meat, and we're saying from the extra hay in the word hatmeim, that brine is forbidden, is asur, and it will be soaked up by the kosher meat, and that's geferlach, that is an issue. Fragdi Gemara v'leimale midishmul. Why doesn't Rava answer from Rami Bar Rochel's Zayde? Shmuel, the Amar Shmuel says Shmuel, maliach hareu kurosech, v'kavish hareu kimvushel. That maliach, salting, which is what they were doing here, they were salting the meats, is like cooking them. And therefore we should say, I think, if I understand correctly, therefore we should say it's as though the treifa and the kosher meat were cooked together. Therefore it's going to be a problem. And for the Gemara, even the Shmuel, here's the thing. You see, the benefit of Rava's answer is that Rava brings up this concept of the tzir, of this liquid that is released from the kosher meat, but more importantly here, the treif meat that's going to be absorbed by the kosher meat. This concept of this liquid, of this brine, and this brine is, right, this tzir is asur. So Rava is telling us that this tzir is asur, which we wouldn't know from Shmuel. Shmuel doesn't say anything about the tzir, and the tzir is the concern here. So in terms of Shmuel, I would think that the main concern is blood, and we aren't concerned about the blood here because we're saying that both meats are busy expelling their bloods, they're not absorbing other blood. Really, the issue here is the tzir, and we don't know that from Shmuel when he says Maliach hareu kiroseach. How about tziron? You can skip the next word. Lo, I wouldn't know that from Shmuel's statement, Kamash Malon. Therefore, what Rava teaches us is that this tzir, this liquids that emerge other than the blood while you're salting, is going to be an issue for a treifa. And if it gets absorbed, which it will get absorbed by the kosher meat, that's going to be a problem. And that is what's learned from Rava's answer. Meisvei, we, however, have a contradiction. We're saying that this tzir is asur. I will make an argument from the following brisa that tzir is mutter. Dog tar shemalchum dog tame. If you are salting kosher fish with tummy fish. Now, fish, I believe that their blood, I don't think is an issue. I think you're just salting it because you want salted fish. So meizve dog tar shemalchum dog tame. Okay, so you have a kosher fish and you have a non-kosher fish, and you're salting them zusammen, you salt them together. Mutter, it is permitted. My love, she ayu shnei meluchin. So, is it not talking about a scenario where you are salting both the kosher fish as well as the non-kosher fish, which means that both are producing brine, this tzir, and there is no concern about the kosher fish absorbing the brine of the non-kosher fish. So apparently, this tzir is nish geferlich, is not an issue. Lo, maliach v'tamei tafel. No, you only salted the kosher fish, which means that there was only brine from the kosher fish. The non-kosher fish was not salted, and there was no brine from it to be concerned about. But if you continue reading in that same brisa, it says exactly the case that we just said. That if the tor was salted and the tamei fish was not, mutter. All good. So michlal, the reisha v'sheshnei meluchin askinan. Doesn't that imply that therefore the first part, the reisha, is talking about when both were salted? Meaning, we have two cases in this brisa. Right? What's the first case? The first case is dog tor shemalchum dog tamei. The next case is tar maliach v'tamei tafel. So the first case is a kosher and non-kosher fish, right? Kosher and non-kosher fish that are salted. The second one is talking about where the kosher fish is salted and the non-kosher fish is not, implying that the first case is talking about where both of them are salted. And even so, we're saying that the kosher fish is kosher. We're not concerned about the brine from the non-kosher fish. And for the Gemara, no. It's all one case, in fact. Parusha kamifarish, that the Seifa is explaining the Reisha, meaning, tahor shemalchum dog tamei, that if you salt a kosher fish with a non-kosher fish, mutter, it is permitted. Keitzad, in what case is it mutter? Shayator maliach v'tamei tafel, if the kosher fish was salted, but the non-kosher fish was left alone. In that case, the kosher fish is kosher. But if they were both salted, it would be geferlich, because the non-kosher fish would release tzir, which would be absorbed by the kosher fish, and it would be a big problem. Okay, so we want to say that the brisa is talking about just one case, and that the Seifa is explaining the Reisha, and that when the kosher fish is salted and the non-kosher fish is left alone, it's kosher. But if both the kosher fish and the non-kosher fish are salted, not kosher. It's a problem, because the kosher fish is going to absorb the brine of the non-kosher fish. Now, ochinami mistaver, and we want to say that this must be the way to explain the brisa, that we're explaining it correctly. Reisha shnei meluchim, because if it enters your mind that the brisa is talking about two scenarios, and the first one is talking about when both are salted, and even in that case the kosher fish is kosher, Well, then I wouldn't need both cases. If the brisa is talking about two different cases, and the first one is that if both are salted, the kosher one remains kosher. Well, if when both are salted, the kosher one remains kosher, even though there is going to be the brine of the tameh fish to be concerned about, and yet we say the kosher fish is kosher, certainly then, when the non-kosher fish is unsalted and left alone, the kosher fish is going to be kosher. So I don't need then that second case. So therefore, it must be the fact that there are two cases, it's really just one case, and that the second case is explaining the first case. To which the Gemara says, not necessarily. It's not really a good proof necessarily. Right? We don't necessarily disagree with the premise, but it's not necessarily a good proof to say that it's talking about one thing, because I could theoretically argue that it is talking about two scenarios, and that when both are salted, I could argue that the kosher one remains kosher. And how do I explain the brisa? Well, that I could argue that the brisa is talking about two cases. The first one is when both the kosher and non-kosher fish are salted, and the kosher fish nonetheless remains kosher. The second case is when the kosher fish is salted and the non-kosher fish is not, and the kosher fish is also kosher. And why do I need both cases then? Right? We said all she needs is the first case. Well, we need the second case in order to make it clear that the first case is when both are salted. The lo tema, that if there was only one case, maybe you would say reisha tar maliach v'tafel tameh v'tameh tafel. Right? If I only had one case, I would say, oh yeah, that's talking about because the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was not, and that's why the kosher fish is kosher. But if both were salted, also, I would say that the kosher fish is also, since it soaked up the brine from the non-kosher fish. So meaning, it's a little bit tricky. These aren't like such hard gemaras, but they're very difficult to explain in a way that is clear. But anyways, so what have we? So what has just happened? What has happened is, from the very beginning of the Gemara, we're talking about this brine, that a brine that comes from a treifa will be soaked up by the kosher meat, and it's going to be a problem. And so this concept of brine is geferlich is a problem. However, we ask the kasha from a brisa that's talking about fish brine, where apparently you can salt kosher and non-kosher fish together, and it's not a problem. We're not concerned about the non-kosher brine. That's the question that we're asking from the brisa. To which we say, no, we're reading the brisa wrong. We are concerned about the non-kosher brine. The only reason why the kosher fish remains kosher is because you didn't actually salt the non-kosher brine. You didn't actually salt the non-kosher fish, and there's no brine for non-kosher fish. But the non-kosher brine would be geferlich, would be a problem. Okay, fine. We then tried to prove that that's the case in the brisa by saying that the seifa of the brisa must be explaining the reisha of the brisa, and it's all talking about where the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was left alone. All we're doing is we're saying that isn't really a good proof. I could argue that the reisha of the brisa is talking about where both were salted and still it's kosher, because we're not concerned about the brine of the non-kosher fish. I could make that argument and say that I need both cases, because if I only had one case, I would say that one case is talking about where the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was left alone. Therefore, I need both cases to say that even when both of them are salted, even then it's talking about, even then it's kosher. But again, we don't necessarily say that way. It's very confusing to explain. The point being that we tried to ask a question and say that the brine of a non-kosher fish is not a problem. We are saying that the brine of the non-kosher fish is a problem. Tana seifa tor maliach v'tamei tafel. Now, the sorry, aval shnei meluchin asur satana seifa tar maliach v'tar mitafel mechlal dereisha shnei meluchin v'afilu achishari. Okay, again, this is how you can theoretically explain the brisa, that therefore we need both cases where basically to say that when both fish are salted, the kosher fish is kosher, as well as when only the kosher fish is salted, the kosher fish is kosher. Now, Toshma come in here, Miseifa from the brisa continues and says, Miseifa the Seifa from like the very last part of the brisa, Aval im hoya tame maliach, if the non-kosher fish was salted, vitar tafel, and the kosher fish was left alone, asur. In that case, it is asur. Tame maliach vitar tafel hu de asur. We want to imply, okay, that it's asur because the non-kosher fish was salted and the kosher fish was left alone. That is why it's a problem, because the kosher fish is going to absorb from the non-kosher brine. Hashnein meluchim, but does that not imply that if both were salted shari, then it would be permitted that only, specifically when it's only the non-kosher fish that is salted, that's when it's a problem. But if the kosher fish and non-kosher fish were salted, maybe would that not imply that it would be okay, since both the kosher fish and the non-kosher fish are busy expelling whatever they're expelling at the same time, and therefore nothing's absorbing anything? So we say no. When you have the kosher fish and the non-kosher fish, and they're both salted, it will be a problem. But Ari Ditana Reisha Tar Malech Vitame Tafel, since in the earlier part of the brisa it mentioned when the kosher fish is salted and the non-kosher fish is not, so it also did the reverse at the very end of the brisa. Tanami Seifa Tami Malech, when the non-kosher fish is salted Vitar Tafel and the kosher fish is left alone, it is a problem. But that's really for consistency, not actually to imply that when they're both salted it's okay. Anyways, that was a very, not difficult, but tricky way to essentially make the point that brine of a non-kosher fish, of a treifa, they are going to be asur. Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel in basar yotze midei damo ela imkein molcho yafe yafe madicho yafe yafe. In order to remove blood from meat, you have to salt it very, very well, and you need to wash it off, to rinse it off very, very well. Idmar, Rav Huna Amar says, Rav Huna, moleach umadiach, you have to salt the meat and wash it off. Masin Satan, it's learned in a brisa, madiach umoleach umadiach. You have to first wash off the meat and then salt it and then wash it off again. V'lo pligei, they do not argue. It depends. If they already washed it off one time by the butcher, so then you just need to salt and wash it a second time. If they haven't washed it off at the butcher, so you have to wash it first and then salt it and then wash it off the second time. Rav Dimi ben Ardaya, malach le b'milcha glal nisa. Rav Dimi ben Ardaya would salt using a very thick salt, u'menapetz le, and he would have to shake off the salt first before washing it off. Rav Mishasha ein machzikin dam b'vnei me'ayin, says Rav Mishasha, we're not. I think that there's different ways to understand it, but we're not concerned about blood from the intestines. Tirgama a karkasha ume'aya v'hadura dichanta. There's different ways to understand this. Let's just say it's talking about all of the intestines, from the keres all the way, through the four stomachs and the small intestines all the way out of the cow that or the animal. That whole digestive system, we're not concerned about blood there. Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel ein manichin basar maliach ela al gabe kli menukav. When you are salting meat, you have to salt the meat on a vessel that has holes at the bottom so that the blood can drain out of the vessel and not pool at the bottom of the vessel and get reabsorbed. Rav Sheshes malach le garma garma. Rav Sheshes would salt one limb at a time. Trey my time low. Why wouldn't he salt two at a time, 2 limbs at a time? Mishum de parish me'ayu valahai. Well, because if you salt 2 limbs in parallel, so then the blood can leave one limb and enter into the other. Chad nami parish me'agiso vala agiso. But can't you say the same thing even by one limb? That the blood will drain out of one part of the limb and be absorbed by another part of the limb. Ela lo shna. Rather, it doesn't matter. You can also salt multiple limbs at a time. And finally, if you shecht an animal, and before it is dead and completely drained out its blood, you break its neck. What will happen is that will slow down the blood draining from the animal, and blood is going to be absorbed in the limbs of the animal. It's going to make the meat heavier, and it's going to be stealing from people, and it swallows blood it absorbs blood in the limbs. Ibayil asked a question. We're going to explain what this means right now. Hey Chikamer, what exactly are we saying? So we're saying if you slaughter the animal and before it drains all of its blood, you break its neck, and that is going to have the effect of slowing down the draining of the blood. And what's going to happen is what's going to happen is basically the blood is not going to drain. If the blood doesn't drain, where's it going to go? It's going to get absorbed into the meat. Which machbedas basar, if the blood is getting absorbed in the meat, it's going to weigh down the meat. If it goes to the sabrios, and if the meat is heavier, well, people are going to be paying more for it, because if you're paying by the kilo and it weighs more kilos, so people are going to be paying more. But what they're paying more for is really blood. Mishum de mavliya dam bevarim, because the blood, instead of leaving the animal, is staying in the animal and getting absorbed in the limbs and in the meat. So people are paying for heavier meat, but the meat is heavy because you're paying for blood. So haladide shapri damri, do we say, okay, but if the issue is that you're stealing from people, well, what if you're just shechting your own meat? Can you break the animal's neck and the blood will get stored up in the limbs? I don't know why you'd want to do that, but whatever. If the main concern is theft, this isn't theft. It's just for yourself. Or maybe for him also it's also because you don't want bloody. If the meat is too bloody, it's going to be difficult to get rid of the blood properly, and you're likely going to be eating blood. Teku, so we say it's a tie. So probably the best thing is just shech the animal and let it bleed out as quickly and efficiently and humanely as possible. Now we get to a new short Mishnah. Somebody who puts chicken, bird meat, and cheese on the same table, is not violating any mitzvahs lo saisei, says the Gemara, ha'ochlo over below saisei. The implication being, okay, just putting, let's say chicken, I use chicken as an example of meat, of bird meat. So just putting chicken on the table with cheese is nicht gefährlich. But the implication is, but if you go further than that, ha'ochlo, if you eat the chicken and the cheese, over below saisei, ataka will be a mitzvah lo saisei, shmamina basar of bechalav da'iraisa, which means that according to this Tana, the bird meat with milk is also midaraisa. We're saying, putting it on the table is not also midaraisa, but eating it is also midaraisa. Ema, rather, I'll say not necessarily. It could also be midarabanan, as we're going to see in the Mishnah that we're going to learn and start on the next line. I could say that if you put bird meat and cheese on the same table, I could say you are not going to. It's not going to lead to a violation of a negative commandment, because there is no negative commandment regarding chicken meat, regarding bird meat and cheese. So I could argue that bird meat and cheese is in fact only asur midrabanan. And now we get to a new Mishnah where we discuss which meats and which milks are included in the prohibition of those svashukali bechalav. Imo says the Mishnah, basar behema ta'ora, bechalav behema ta'ora. The flesh of a kosher animal, a goat, a cow, a lamb, bechalav behema ta'ora, in the milk of a kosher animal. Now, I imagine, I don't know, it could be that this includes even chayas as well. Anyways, basar behema tahora, bechalav behema tahora, the flesh of a, it's like not super clear. Is behema tahora, because behema, does that include chayas? Let's go with behemas. It's actually a little bit not clear. Anyways, so actually looking at Tosfos over here, it would seem, okay, according to the Tanakam, it's taka, yeah, it's behema, chayas, and ofis are also mid oraisa. So, but beside behema Torah, the flesh of a kosher animal, whether we're talking about a behema, whether we're talking about a chay, whether we're talking about an oaf, bechalav behema Torah, in the milk of a kosher animal, also levashel v'asu bano, you can't cook it, nor can you get any kind of benefit from basar bechalav. Can't cook it, you can't get benefit from it. Now, basar behema tahora, bechalav behema tameh, but if you have the flesh of a kosher animal in the milk of a non-kosher animal, basar behema tameh, bechalav behema tahora, or the flesh of a non-kosher animal cooked in kosher milk, mutar levashel mutar bano. That is no violation of los vashukti b'chalav. You can cook it, you can get benefit from it. You can't eat it, obviously, because we're talking about kosher, a non-kosher food. But basar b'chalav applies to kosher animals and kosher milk. If any of the components are non-kosher, there's no issue of cooking it, getting benefit from it. Now, here comes the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Omer, chayav va'of eina min haTorah. Says Rabbi Akiva that chayas and ofis are not midoraisa. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, l'shavasuk di b'chalav shalosh paimim. The pasuk of l'shavasuk di b'chalav appears in the Holy Torah 3 times. Prat l'chaya, once is to exclude chayas, v'la'of, a second time to exclude birds, v'la behema tmeya, and a third time to exclude non-kosher animals. So when it says gedi 3 times, it means a gedi, which we're going to learn in the Gemara, includes not just goats, but also cows and sheep, to the exclusion of chayas, to the exclusion of birds, and to the exclusion of non-kosher animals. So according to Rabbi Akiva, only goats, sheep, and cows are included in the prohibition of meat and milk. Rabbi Yossi mida oraisa. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, nemer lo sochlu kol levela, that in the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, when it says, I'll read you the whole pasuk, lo sochlu kol nevela, so the same pasuk that talks about milk and meat also talks about nevela. So it says Rabbi Yossi, lo sochlu kol nevela, v'nema lo svashli b'chalavimo. And the same pasuk that talks about don't eat nevela says don't cook meat and milk. As she also mishum nevela, also levashel b'chalav. So in things that are also because of nevela, so you're not allowed to cook in milk. So, for example, kosher animals, right? Because non-kosher animals are not also because of nevela; they are also they're also because they are not kosher. What about oaf? What about birds? Shasum mishum nevela yachol also levasha b'chalav. What about birds? Right? Birds have nivla sof tar. So birds are also because of nevela. So maybe they should be included in the Isser Basar B'chalav Tamalomer, B'chalev Imo Yotza Ov She'eno Chalev Eim. Says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, birds don't produce milk. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that there's a juxtaposition between nevela and Lo Sfashik de B'chalev Imo. Any animal that's shaykh to nevela, which I believe basically means kosher animals, because non-kosher animals, if you eat them, you're not in violation of nevela, you're in violation of eating non-kosher animals. So basically, kosher animals, behemas, chayas, even ofis, they have a din of nevela if you eat them. And it says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the juxtaposition of nevela and nosvashik de b'chalavimo in the same pasuk, we're going to say that whatever meat as a din of nevela is shaykh to nosvashik de b'chalavimo. That would include behemas, that would include chayas. And says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, we have a havmina to say maybe should even include ofis, because ofis also have a din of nevela. To which we say, yeah, but it says b'chalev imo. The only meats that are included are meats that whose mother has milk. No birds, right? Bird mothers don't produce milk. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, while behemas and chayas are included in the Isser of Los Vashkei B'chalev Imo, birds are excluded. It says the Gemara B'nai, how do we know that when it says gidi, it's not just goats, but it's also sheep and it's also cows? Well, Amr Beloz Amr Kro Vayishlach Yehuda as Gedi Ha'izim, that Yehuda sent to Tamar the Gedi Ha'izim. Kan Gedi Izim Hu, right? It says he sent the goat kid. Komakum Shenemar Gedi Komakum Shenemar Gedi Stam Afilu Par Varachol B'Mashma. That by Yehuda slept with Tamar as and it was assumed that Tamar, of course, was a prostitute, and he was sending her as her payment a Gedi Izim. And it says Dafka Gedi Izim to point out that we're specifically talking about a goat here. But if it wouldn't have said Gedi Izim, just Gedi, it could have been a cow, it could have been a sheep. Okay, but why don't we say that just like the Gedi by Yehuda was a goat? So whenever it says Gedi, it means goat. So Ksiv Achrina, we have another pasuk by Yaakov Avinu. Orus Gedoye Izim, Rivka advises Yaakov Avinu to basically slip in there and get the brachas from Yitzchak, and she prepares for him a Gedi Izim, and it said she took the hides, and I think that was probably what she gave him to wear, right? Bisha al Yadav, yeah. Anyways, so it says Gedoye Izim there as well. So kan Gedoye Izim Hakol Makom Shenemar Gedi Stam Afilu Par Varachol B'Mashma. So here as well we make the same limud that it says Gedoye Izim here, specifically goats, but if it would just say Gedi, it could be goats, sheep, cows. So again, we had a pasuk that said Gedi Izim by Yehuda, and there it specifically says goats. We say, okay, but why don't we say just like over there it's goat, everywhere it's goat? Well, we have another pasuk which says Gedoye Ha'izim, and that's by Yaakov and Rivka, when Yaakov is going to get the brachas from Yitzchak. V'leilev minei. Okay, but why don't we learn from both Yehuda and Rivka to say that just like in both those cases it's goats, so also it's always Gedi is always just goats. Of course, the concept of Shnei Ksuvin Abayin Ke'echad, that sure, initially when we were only aware of Yehuda, that it says Gedi Ha'izim by Yehuda, and we suggested that, well, just like by Yehuda it's goats, so let's say that it's always goats. Sure, that could work. But when you have two cases that mention Gedi Ha'izim, now we get suspicious, because if we wanted to apply it everywhere, just say it in one place, and we'll apply it everywhere from that one place, just like it's goats in that place. It's goats in every place. But when you specifically have two cases where it says goats, we assume it's just those two cases, not every other place. Because if it was every other place, you just need to write it in one place. Since he wrote it in two places, it's limited to just those two places and nowhere else. That's all fine and good if you hold that way, that when you have something written in specifically two places, it's limited to those two places. But according to the opinion who says that even when you have something written in two places, it could still be applied more broadly. So we should theoretically be able to say that just like by Yehuda and by Rivka, it says Gedi Izim, goats. So therefore, it should be so it's just like by those two cases, places it says goats. So it's always goats. Well, Trey Mu'ute Ksive Izim Ha'izim. Both by Yehuda and by Rivka it says Ha'izim. By Yehuda it says Gedi Ha'izim, and by Rivka it says Gedaye Ha'izim. And therefore the extra Ha is saying this specific case is a goat, but other cases could be cows, could be sheep. Okay? So whenever, the point being, when it says Gedi alone, it could be sheep, goats, cows. If it says Gedi Izim or Gedi Ha'izim or Gedaye Ha'izim, so then it's specifically goats. Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel, Gedi, l'rabos es he acheleb. Now, I think I had mentioned earlier, right, that all these Gedis are technically extra, right? Because if we're saying, I don't remember if I said it earlier, whatever it is, I'm saying it now at least, that we had just said that when it says Gedi, it means not just goats, but goats, sheep, and cows. So technically it could say lo savashal behema bechalav imo, but it says gidi. Why does it say gidi? We're going to learn things out from each instance of gidi. Amar Shmuel, gidi l'rabos es acheleb. Gidi comes to include cheleb. That of course we know that there is a prohibition against eating cheleb. But if you cook cheleb in milk, there is an additional prohibition of basar bechalav. You're in violation of basar bechalav in addition to cheleb. Gidi l'rabos es amesa, also nevela. That if you cook nevela in milk, there is an added prohibition of basar bechalav. Gidi l'rabos es shlil. And to include a fetus, if one cooks a fetus in milk, there is a violation of basar bechalav. Gedi lahotzi es adam, and it's talking about the meat of the goat to the exclusion of its blood. There's no isser of cooking blood in milk. That's not basar bechalav specifically. Gedi lahotzi es ashilya, or the placenta. There's no violation of basar bechalav when cooking placenta in milk. Gedi lahotzi es atmeya, and gedi is to exclude non-kosher animals. Non-kosher animals, it's okay to cook them in milk. There's no basar bechalav violation there. Bechalav imo, when we're talking about the milk, bechalav imo v'lo bechalav zachar, not in the milk of a male. Now that sounds very strange. Males don't have milk. Well, one way to answer is, I saw in a note in the art school, apparently, in very rare cases, males can grow udders and have a small amount of milk. That sounds like a bit of a chiddush. I think Rashi seems said also, right? Chalav mu'at min adadim kigon im nishtana. What does that even mean? But anyways, at the very end of the Gemara today, we are going to learn out a different limud. There's going to be a nafkamina here from zachar. So maybe let's put a pin in that, and we'll get back to the v'lo b'chalav zachar. B'chalav imo v'lo b'chalav shchuta. This excludes any milk of a shechted animal, right? A shechted animal, and there's milk in the animal. Basar b'chalav does not apply to that milk. B'chalav imo v'lo b'chalav tmeya, and not the milk of a non-kosher animal. Okay. Essentially, so it says gedi 3 times, from which we learn 6 things, and it says chalev imo, from which we learn 3 things. Hatlasa gedi ksive v'anan shisa dashinan. How could it be that it says gedi 3 times, and yet we learned 6 things from them? Kasover Shmuel, well, I'll tell you why. Because Shmuel holds isser chal al isser. Shmuel holds that one isser can fall on another isser. Be'isser chelev umesa michad kronafki. So now, if you say isser chal al isser, then essentially the first gedi is coming to teach that isser chal al isser, meaning that when it says gedi, when it says goat, that even includes the chelev of the goat, chelev which already is asur as chelev, and if you cook it in milk, there is going to be the added isser of basar b'chalav, and this also applies to another instance of isser chal al isser, which is nevela. Nevela is already asur, but if the animal is nevela and you cook it in milk, there's going to be the additional violation of basar b'chalav. So therefore, when it said that, right, so you have the first gedi, which is coming to say that basar b'chalav applies also to pre-existing isers regarding this animal, whether that's chelev, whether that's nevela. Nafke, fine. Dam nami lav gedihu. Now, the fact of the matter is, blood. You don't need the word gedi to exclude blood. Blood is just simply is not part of the meat of the animal, so it's really not. We don't really need to exclude it specifically. It's never really included because it's not the meat of the animal. It's the blood of the animal. We also don't technically need to exclude we don't need a pasuk to exclude the placenta either. The placenta is not considered part of the animal itself. It's something that's separate from the animal. So far we've gone through 4 of these 6 items. Chelev, nevela, which we said are essentially learned out from both from the same instance of gedi, since that's really just coming to include in the isser any isser chalal isser scenarios. So nevela and chayav are from the same pasuk. Dam and shilya don't actually need to be excluded because they really should never even be included in the first place. So pashalu trey, we have two gedis left over. Chad l'rabos is a shlil. One is to include a fetus, that the fetus, the actual baby that's growing inside a mother, there would be a din of basar bechalav for it. And the final gedi is to exclude non-kosher animals. A non-kosher animal cooked in milk is no violation of basar bechalav. V'savar Shmuel Isser Chal Isser. Now, frag the Gemara, does Shmuel really hold Isser Chal al Isser, that a new Isser can be stacked onto a pre-existing Isser? That if you take chayav, for example, that's already Asr, and you cook it in milk, there is now the added Isser of basar bechalav. V'Amar Shmuel, but didn't Shmuel say Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, the name of Rabbi Eliezer? And as Rashi points out, Shmuel and Rabbi Eliezer certainly did not overlap. Rabbi Eliezer was an early Tana. Tanas go back, but he was alive during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and Shmuel is an Amora who lived in Babble. So they did not overlap. Nonetheless, Rashi says that when you could still, when you say Mishum, right? If it says Shmuel says then Mishum from Rabbi Eliezer, it means that he heard either from somebody who heard either directly from Rabbi Eliezer, from somebody who heard from Rabbi Eliezer. So Shmuel is saying from Rabbi Eliezer, so now normally if a person is tameh and they eat truma, right? If a kohen is tameh and he eats truma, so normally a kohen is allowed to eat truma, obviously, but if he's tameh, then he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. But what if the truma was already tameh? Now I didn't realize this, but if you eat truma that is already tameh, so if you have a Torah person who eats truma tameya, I thought he was chayav misa b'dei shamayim. He's not, and apparently we already learned this, I think, in Yevamis. But he's not chayav misa b'dei shamayim. It's just an isser. It's learned out from whatever. There's a drasha that learns that it's an isser essay. It's a mitzvah slow essay. It's a lava b'machal essay, and there's no misa b'dei shamayim. If there's truma that's tameya and the kohen eats it, there's no misa b'dei shamayim. He's violating a mitzvah's essay. Now, so the pasuk says, from which we learn out that if the truma is tahora and the kohen is tameh, he's tameh and he eats the truma tahora, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. But if that truma was already tameya, so he was not allowed to eat it. If now he becomes tameh and he eats that truma, he will not be chayav misa b'dei shamayim since it was already tameh and there was already a mitzvah's essay that he would be in violation of. How do we know that a kohen who's tameh she'achal truma tameya, that who ate truma that's already tameh she'eino b'misa, that he's not going to be chayav misa b'dei shamayim? Shenemar umesu bo ki yichalalu, that when you chayav misa b'dei shamayim ki yichalalu, if the kohen is tameh and is mechalel that truma, prat lezoshet mechuleles v'omedes, to the exclusion of truma that's already tameya, he's not being mechalet, it's already tameya, and if he eats it, he is not chayav misa b'dei shamayim. So we see ein isser chal al isser. So on the one hand, Shmuel is saying isser chal al isser, and therefore we use that. That's what we're learning from the first gedi, and therefore we come to include chayav and nevela, because isser chal al isser. And yet Shmuel is quoting from Rabbi Eliezer that when it comes to a tamei kohen who eats truma that's already tameya, we say he's not chayav misa b'dei shamayim because ein isser chal al isser. So Ibai Sema, one way to answer it is ba'alma isser chal al isser. So one way to answer it is that generally, like we initially said, Shmuel holds isser chal al isser. V'shani yosem, it's different when it comes to truma. Demi'et achmanu umesu bo ki yichalalu. Because the Torah specifically has a pasuk to say that misa b'dei shamayim would not apply. It says mesu bo ki yichalalu. Prat lezeh, that's already tamei. So in general, Shmuel would say isser chal al isser. But if the Torah tells you specifically by a tamei kohen who eats tamei truma that there's no chayav misa b'dei shamayim, so the Torah says. Alternatively, Shmuel ain't isser chal al isser. You could say the opposite. In general, Shmuel holds ain't isser chal al isser, like we saw by the truma tameya. V'shani ya'acha, it's different by basar bechalav, di Rabbi Rachmana gedi, because the Torah, instead of writing behema, it writes gedi. And that's to teach us something, and that's to teach us that it even includes the chayav of the gedi, if the gedi is nevela, still it's going to be included in basar bechalav, because so the Torah says, so even though in general you would say ein isur chalav l'isur, here the Torah says to include chayav, to include nevela v'baisema, or alternatively adidei adrabe, you could say that Shmuel holds, like we said, isur chalav l'isur. When he says by Truma ein isur chalav l'isur, it's because he's quoting Rabbi Eliezer. So Shmuel, it's not necessarily Shmuel's opinion. Shmuel could say isur chalav l'isur. He's quoting Rabbi Eliezer, who says ein isur chalav l'isur. Okay, fine. But Aminei Rav Achdavoy Bar Ami Meirove Rav Achdavoy Bar Ami asked Rav Amavashal bechalev gedish lo yinikamav. Okay, what if somebody cooks meat in the milk of a animal that has never yet milked? So meaning it was pregnant, but it hadn't yet given birth, but it already had developed milk. So what if you cook in that milk, the milk of a mother who never actually milked, who never actually nursed? So Amalis Rava answers me, from the fact that Shmuel needed to say bechalev imo and not the milk of a male, what it's saying is a male never becomes a mother, and therefore its milk would be excluded from basar bechalav. But this animal, which has never given birth and has never actually nursed, but is pregnant and has already developed milk, since it can give birth and it can nurse because it's a female, so therefore there would be a violation of basar bechalav cooking in its milk. And I wonder if you can argue, because this concept of the milk of a male is so strange. Maybe you could say that no, there is no milk of a male, but the point is to make this limud. Kilu chalev imo, so dafka needs to be imo, to the exclusion of a male, but so long as it's not a male, it would be considered imo. So therefore, if you have this animal that is pregnant, but has not yet given birth, and is not yet nursed, but has milk, well, it's okay. As long as it's not a zachar, it would be included in, well, it's not okay, it would be included in the isser of basar bechalav. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Yud Gimel, Daf 113 of Masechta Chullin. On the first part of Daf 113 of Masechta Chullin, we were talking about brines of meats, brines of fish, that if you have kosher meat and treif meat and you're salting them together, we have to be concerned that brine is going to be released from the treif meat and be absorbed into the kosher meat, even though it's busy expelling its blood, but the brine is easier to absorb because it's more of a liquid. We said that the same applies to fish as well, fish brine. So if you have the brine of a non-kosher fish, it will be absorbed by a kosher fish. We then got into salting meat, and that you need to wash the meat, salt it, and then afterwards wash off the salt once again. And then we got to a new Mishnah where we discussed a three-way machlokas about what does basar bechalav apply to and what doesn't apply to. According to Tanna Kama, basar bechalav applies to all kosher animals, birds, so chayas, behemoths, chayas, ophis, according to Tanna Kama, are included in basar bechalav, provided that they are cooked in the milk of a kosher animal. According to Rab Akiva, only cows, goats, and sheep are included. However, chayas and ophis are excluded because it says gedi 3 times, one to exclude chayas, one to exclude ophis, and one to exclude non-kosher animals. According to Yossi HaGalili, he says the juxtaposition of nevela to basar bechalav in the same pasuk means that animals that are shaykh to the din of nevela, behemoths, chayas, are shaykh to basar bechalav. The question is, what about ophis? Because ophis can also be nevela. Say ena chanami, but it says chalev imo, and birds, right? Mother birds don't have milk. And then in the Gemara, we learned out how we know that gedi stam means not just goats, but also sheep and cows. And we learned the shita of Shmuel, who includes in the prohibition of basar bechalav also chalev, also nevela, as well as a fetus, and we exclude a non-kosher animal from Gedi as well, friends. That was Daf Kuf Yud Gimel, Daf 113 of Masechta Chullin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day and a great Shabbos. Cheers.